The assignment to that cabin actually came with very little choice. This winter had made several monitoring points unreachable, and I was among the few staff still willing to be stationed alone. My job in the forestry department usually revolves around reports and data, not staying out in the field for days on end. But this time, it was different. New landslide sensors needed to be monitored directly, and my supervisor said the cabin on the northern slope was still fit to be occupied. I treated it as a routine task. Cold, quiet, exhausting, but not dangerous. At least, that's what I thought before I left. The cabin was built for one person. That was an old decision by the forestry department. Cheaper, easier to abandon when snow sealed off the access. It sat on the northern slope, far enough from hiking trails to avoid tourists, yet close enough to the tree line to monitor potential summer wildfires. In winter, the cabin was supposed to be empty. This year, it wasn't. I was assigned to stay for a full 3 weeks to monitor the newly installed avalanche sensors. The system was simple. Manual readings twice a day, recording snow pressure, then a weekly report. There was no internet connection. The radio was only for weather updates and emergency calls. Food was delivered before the first storm. After that, I was alone. The early days went according to plan. I followed the schedule, cleared snow from the roof, checked the generator, and kept the fire in the stove low, so the wood would last until the end of the assignment. The wind came and went. The forest remained silent. On the 5th day, I found something that wasn't listed in the inventory. A small wooden bench behind the cabin, half buried in snow, facing directly toward the back wall. The bench was not part of the structure. The wood was newer than the cabin. The nails were different. I cleared it a little and moved it aside, thinking it might be leftover from the sensor construction team. I logged it as a minor finding. There was no urgency, no reason to be suspicious. That night, the temperature dropped, faster than usual. The fire dimmed more often. I added more wood and went to sleep, fully dressed. On the 9th day, one of the sensors sent an inconsistent reading. The numbers dropped sharply, then returned to normal within an hour. Technically, that could happen due to shifting snow layers. Procedurally, I had to perform a direct inspection. The location was behind the cabin, about 200 meters down the slope. I left after lunch, carrying measuring tools and the radio. Near the sensor, I noticed another mark in the snow. Not a footprint, more like a long drag, irregular, ending right beside the sensor pole. I crouched down, checked the cable. Nothing was damaged. The sensor was properly installed. When I returned to the cabin, the front door was closed. That wasn't strange. The wind often pushed it shut, but I was certain I had wedged it open with a small wooden block. The block was now lying on the other side of the threshold. Inside, the temperature was warmer than it should have been. The stove was still burning with fresh wood inside it. I stood there for a long moment before moving. Nothing was missing. Nothing had been noticeably displaced, but my daily logbook was open to a page I hadn't written yet. There was a single line written in pencil, neat in block letters. The second sensor is always wrong when the wind comes from the west. The note was correct, but it wasn't information in the manual, and I had never written it. I erased the line, closed the book, and decided not to report anything until there was clearer evidence. Sending a report without solid grounds would only complicate the assignment. That night, I heard footsteps outside the cabin. Not heavy, regular. They stopped directly behind the wall, where the wooden bench had been earlier. The footsteps did not turn into knocking. There was no sound of the door being tested. After a few minutes, the noise faded, as if moving away toward the forest. I waited until morning to go outside. Fresh snow had partially covered the tracks, but behind the cabin, the wooden bench had returned to its original position, facing the wall directly beneath the small kitchen window. I moved it again, this time farther away, and marked its location on a rough map I had drawn myself. In the following days, the sensor readings turned strange again. Whenever the wind blew from the west, and each time it happened, the bench always moved on its own, little by little, back to its original spot. On the 17th day, my firewood was dwindling faster than I had calculated. I recounted it. There was a small discrepancy, but consistent, not large enough to panic, small enough to be doubtful. I decided to reduce the fire and sleep colder. The next morning, I found the wood neatly stacked by the stove, neater than I usually arranged it. I didn't light the fire that day. I sat still, taking notes, and waited. Evacuation came earlier than scheduled because of a major storm. The replacement team found the cabin in normal condition. The wooden bench was logged as an old facility. The second sensor was still considered a technical fault. In my final report, there was no mention of footsteps, the pencil note, or the self-stacked wood. I only added one sentence. In the recommendations section, winter cabins should not be occupied alone. That sentence was removed in the final revision. The cabin didn't belong to me, but it was my responsibility that week. An old wooden building on the northern slope, 2 hours on foot from the nearest road, used as a winter research outpost by the institution I worked for. The assignment was simple on paper. Check the inventory, log the temperature, make sure the backup generator could still be started, then stay for 3 nights before the next team came up. Extreme weather wasn't a surprise. The forecast had already said the wind would drop sharply and the temperature would fall. Isolation was part of the job. I arrived before dark, closed the door tightly, and turned on the main light. On the wall near the cabinet, there was a whiteboard with a list of tasks. The name of the last person on duty was still written there, half crossed out. There was a small note beneath it, written quickly. The radio cuts out often. Use the schedule. I nodded to myself, noting the time for the first check. Everything looked normal until I opened the equipment cabinet and found one shelf empty. Nothing critical, just 2 sets of lithium batteries. That should have been there. I wrote it down in the logbook. Missing could mean they were used by the previous team or taken back down. There was no need to assume anything. I spent the first night on routine, checking the window seals, testing the generator without running it too long, checking the radio. Snow fell like a curtain. The wind made the wooden walls creak, a familiar sound. At 10 p.m., according to schedule, I called the lower station. No response. I waited 10 minutes, tried again, then wrote down. No connection. Outside, visibility dropped to almost 0. There was no reason to go out. On the second morning, I found something that made the routine pause, just for a moment, near the small woodshed. On the eastern side, there were boot prints A single line, neat, leading toward the shed door. The snow overnight should have covered them, but the wind from the west seemed to have cleared that area. I stood in the doorway, counting the distance between each step, adult size. There were no return prints. The shed was locked, its seal intact. I didn't open it. I marked it in the logbook. Tracks do not continue. Wind? The next decision felt small, but decisive. I adjusted the radio schedule, trying more frequently. During the day, I turned on the radio twice. There was a signal, but no voice. I considered heading down, but the storm was predicted to worsen. Later this afternoon, walking in a whiteout was more dangerous than waiting. I decided to stay. As evening slid into night, the main generator briefly dropped its voltage. The lights flickered, then stabilized. I logged it and prepared the backup generator, just in case. While checking the panel, I heard knocking from outside. Not wind striking, not branches. 3 knocks, a pause, 2 knocks. I didn't answer. I turned off the kitchen light and waited. There was no sound after that. After 10 minutes, I looked through the gap in the curtain. There was nothing except snow in motion. On the second night, I slept fully dressed. At 3 a.m., the temperature alarm sounded softly. It had dropped below the designated threshold. I got up, ran the backup generator briefly to stabilize the system, then shut it down, according to procedure. That was when I noticed the shed door, on the eastern side, slightly open, not wide, just enough to see the darkness inside. I was certain I hadn't opened it. I closed it again, secured an extra fastener, and went back to the cabin. I didn't write anything until morning. On the third morning, the radio finally came alive, with static and one clipped sentence from the lower station naming this cabin and asking for status. I replied briefly. Formally, I didn't mention the tracks or the knocking. I reported only the inventory, the temperature, and that I would remain until the weather allowed travel. That decision felt like simplifying something that was complicated, but it was what I could account for. By midday, I found the missing lithium batteries, neatly arranged, under the table, still wrapped in plastic, as if they had just been placed there. There were no wet marks. I wrote it down in the logbook and stopped writing. After that, the storm eased toward evening. When the next team finally arrived, the following day, they asked why I had secured the shed twice and why the radio schedule had been changed. I answered, according to the log. They laughed lightly, said the wind could make many things look strange. I went down without looking back. At the base of the slope, I realized something simple. In weather like that, isolation isn't only about the absence of other people. Sometimes it's about choosing what gets written down and what is allowed to disappear. With the snow